Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
How's it, Nick? Am I on yourself?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, not too bad. And of course, we're also joined by Mr. Chris Hutton. Chris, how are you, and how are you dealing with our load shedding?
And Nick and Marius doing well, thanks. Yeah, enjoying the autumn sunshine. That's the only light that we can get as our national grid is collapsing all around us. But there we go.
Indeed. And I just want to warn of our listeners before we start that Chris may disappear at the end of the show due to being load shed. But that's just how life is these days. I'm actually thinking of getting a uninterrupted power supply UPS because you got to make plans when you can to survive our electricity situation. And I just want to mention, we're not really going to talk about it today, but there's an interesting tweet thread by journalist Diane Hawker, who is a multimedia journalist and news editor at Times Live, who's sharing some screenshots from her counselor, who I think is a DA counselor based in the areas that she's in Johannesburg, just talking about how the big city entity that controls power in Joburg, City Power, is not in a good way. It is, it's like R1 billion in the hole in terms of shortfalls. It doesn't have enough staff, and load shedding is causing all of its equipment to break. So strength to all of those who are in Joburg, as I think all three of us are. Well, not Marius, because he insists that the East Rand is somehow separate from Joburg, but we all know that's a myth. Anyway,
I'm not going to disagree with him. So
it's literally a different municipality.
Yeah. It's a technical thing. You're going to let the government tell you what is and what isn't Joburg.
Nobody says Charlize Theron is from Joburg. Hashtag just saying.
All right, so let's start off with our first story today, and this is about once our former colleague at the IRR and now federal chairperson of the DA, federal council chairperson of the DA, Helen Zille. She was doing a radio interview, I think it was yesterday or the day before, talking about a fire that had happened in Langa in a DA-controlled municipality. This fire had destroyed a lot of people's houses, and she was talking about the government's response to that. She was being sort of pressed on questions around how service delivery is for poorer people in DA-run municipalities. And she said, to be poor in Langa is 100, probably 1,000 times better than being poor in many townships in the rest of the country. She went on to say that in Langa, you're far more likely to have access. So let me quote her directly. People come to the Western Cape in absolutely poverty-stricken in search of jobs, in search of schools, in search of health facilities that all work. Even if you live in a shack, you're far more likely to have electricity, close to access to running water, sewage, and all of those things that people have anywhere that people want anywhere else in the country. And this prompted the sort of predictable outrage. Whenever Helen does a media interview, there's almost always a sort of following outrage. Of course, it started on social media, and that's, that would be a non-story. But what kind of annoyed me, and the reason we're talking about it today, is immediately the News 24 piece that was written on this, which I don't know what it really was about it, but it just kind of got under my skin. So after she made these comments, this piece got written on News 24 where the headline was "Disingenuous and Backward Fallout After Zille's Better to Be Poor in Langa Comment." And basically what happened was the journalist who was writing the story went to a bunch of very anti sort of City of Cape Town civics organizations like the Greater Cape Town Civic Alliance, and just asked them for comment. So the whole story is just basically people bashing Zille. And the criticisms of what she said are not particularly sort of, well put. One of the people quoted says, "It's quite distasteful and backward to try and measure the suffering and despair as a means to coat over the false failings to address the apartheid city. We should be encouraging a more kind and humane response, where it is a disgrace that informal settlements remain as they are, unhygienic and degrading cesspools of human suffering 28 years into our democracy." And a lot of the criticism of Zille's comments sort of seem to be pushing this line that Cape Town is a apartheid city where racial segregation is alive and well, which really doesn't seem to be backed by a lot of evidence. Of course, it's also worth pointing out, and another former colleague of ours, Gwenya, wrote a piece a while ago defending the DA, saying that they do provide services to poor South Africans better, and she cited Stats SA data on that point. So the first point I just want to make on this is, I'm not really sure why there's outrage here, apart from the fact that Zille said it. She's a politician. She's, of course, defending the record of her political party in government. This is not a surprise, and nor should it be to anyone. I don't know what to make of this. Marius, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are two things here. There's a bit of Zille derangement syndrome, I think. And it doesn't matter what Helen Zille says. She could say the sky's blue or Nelson Mandela is the greatest South African that's ever lived. And the usual suspects would come out and say, no, she's, the sky's actually purple and Nelson Mandela was a terrible person, or whatever the case is. But one thing I do think Helen Zille does sometimes have a way of saying things maybe that aren't particularly tactful. And I get the point she's trying to make about Langa, but I think she could maybe have put it a different way. To say it's better to be poor in Cape Town is better than being poor in Bloemfontein or whatever. It's still terrible to be poor. It doesn't matter if you're living in a shack in Langa, it's not much better than living in a shack anywhere else in the country. Or whatever. What comes to mind is when she made the comments about refugees coming from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape. And I understand what she was saying, and perhaps if she was somebody else, the outrage wouldn't have been as much. But I do think, refugees is obviously a bit of a loaded term. She could have easily used a different word. She could have said loads of economic migrants are coming from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape, and she would have been completely correct. And the outrage would have been, there would have been much less outrage, I think, because, that is exactly why people do move in such large numbers from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape, because there are better services and there's better economic opportunities. Those people are economic migrants, and we are a free country. People can move anywhere they want in this country. They can live wherever they want. There's no issue. People shouldn't be restricted from where they want to move to, or whatever the case is. But just one thing on the Gwenya's data that she released here, that she said was from Stats SA. I'm looking at it now, and there are various indicators that look at indigent households that provide with water, electricity, sewage and sanitation. And she is correct in that the Western Cape is the number one for all those various indicators. But they're not particularly far ahead of Hutton, interestingly enough, especially on the provision of electricity. I'm not too sure what the methodology is here, but Western Cape gets a score of 97.9 and Hutton gets a score of 97.4. So it's not actually much. Hutton is not that far off what the Western Cape has achieved in terms of supplying electricity to indigent households. So, interestingly, somewhere like the Free State actually doesn't do too bad on some of these numbers, and the Limpopo is, it's bringing up the rear and with all these indicators. So while I think obviously what Gwena said is completely correct, they're not quite shooting out the lights, and I think I don't think you can argue that the DA government is in general better than ANC, or DA government is better than ANC government. Just about on any indicator we can see that. But I do think they lack on certain issues, and we also got to ask ourselves why in the last local government election, the DA did pretty badly in parts of the country, and including the Western Cape, which, as we know, is a stronghold, especially in the eastern parts of the Western Cape. The more rural areas. After the 2016 election, I think the DA, it's either one. I think there's only about 2 or 3 municipalities where in the Western Cape which it didn't win or didn't emerge as the biggest party, and that number changed quite significantly. I don't have the numbers here at hand, but it lost a lot of support across the country. I think it's Vredendal. I think I'm not sure, the Cedarburg municipality, I think it went from being the single largest party in 2016 to be only being the 3rd biggest party. Local group, I think, was called Cedarburg Eerste or something, came first, and the ANC came second, or vice versa. And I think the DA has got to ask itself some questions why it's losing support in places where it governs. And as we know, the ANC is in a terrible state, and in the Western Cape. But for some reason, a lot of people still seem to prefer that party over the DA, even in places where they've experienced the DA difference, as the DA likes to call it. So I think that's something to think about. And I think the DA, while it's obviously a much better option than the ANC, it's also, I think it should not be off limits to criticize them. And I think there are questions we can ask about the party.
So I must completely disagree with you on the earlier point you made about Zille's use of language. I think that tone policing is often a very cynical way to distract from talking about issues. You can say that refugee is a loaded term, but in the sense that, people have to flee from one area to another because of poor economic opportunities. What is it saying? Is it saying that the claim was that these people are outsiders or foreigners or something like that? But you can have internal refugees, and that's a really common thing. And I think that whole kerfuffle was completely sort of drawn out to distract from the fact that people are leaving one province and going to another in search of a better life. And this is what frustrates me about the sort of tone policing debates, is that it always seems to then end up being about the use of language and never about the actual issues that have been talked about here. And I appreciate that that's certainly not what you intend to do here, Marius, but that seems to be the way that it often ends up in the media. Chris, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with Marius?
I just want to say that, he has more proof that we're not an echo chamber.
Yeah, there you go. Chris, do you agree with me? Do you agree with Marius? What do you make of this fight?
Yeah, that's a bit of a loaded question, so I don't think I'm going to wade into that one just yet. I'll rather comment on Helen Zille, which is a lot less controversial than getting into a debate between Nicholas and Marius. Good thing Gabriel isn't here as well, because then I'd really be in trouble. Just
or
on what, Marius?
Or Harriman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this could be a lot worse, or even Martin van Staden. But anyway, let's stop. Let's draw the line there. Just on Helen's comments, I mean, one could, if you wanted to write a more data-based criticism of her comments, you could disagree with her and say, in terms of sort of poverty creation, as it were, grinding poverty, maybe the DA indeed doesn't have the best record. The ANC has the best record. We have a 35% unemployment rate. We have a record number of people reliant on grants. So maybe you could say the ANC has the policies that create the most poverty around the country, if you want to focus on that metric. In terms of service delivery, I mean, I don't have the points in front of me, for example, from Gwen and Gwenya's article, but I would say that in terms of transparency and service delivery, it is arguably better to at least live in that sort of sphere where government revenue is used for the kind of service delivery that a lot of people nowadays are seeing crumbling all around the country. So basic things like sewage, systems working, fixing potholes, electricity provision, that sort of thing. I would hope that there would be a lot more outrage with things like the diversion of water tankers in parts of KZN to premiers' homes instead of being given to poor citizens who have suffered now from the floods. I would also hope that there's more outrage, again, on a 35% unemployment rate and not on the official opposition federal chairperson's comments in a radio interview. But I suppose maybe another angle to it is that a lot of what she says hits home and speaks a lot of truth. So maybe even with the tone policing points, all of that sort of thing, the content thereof might make people even still uncomfortable about the track record of the ruling party by comparison to what the DA has done in their limited capacity. They don't control national budgets even, but they've done quite a bit of good work in the Western Cape as a whole, I would say.
So one of the things, just before I get back to you, Marius, I want to focus on here is how some of the criticism directed towards Zille said that there has been no improvement in any parts of the country for poor working class people, and everyone is just, people haven't seen any gains of 28 years of democracy. But the IRR has actually made this point, and we got criticized by Helen Zille for it, which is that in a lot of places, and in the Western Cape in particular, but in a lot of places in South Africa, at least until the 2010s, there was significant progress. And the rollout of services has been, at least in its initial phase, relatively successful. And while we had the gear policies we saw and the commodity boom, we saw some real improvement in people's lives. Now, of course, those things have reversed. And I think that that's really the point that we often try to make is, you can fix South Africa, and we have been on a positive trajectory before. This claim that, we've just been in total free fall for 28 years it's funny because in this one, you kind of get people on the far right, who think that the takeover of the ANC was the worst thing in human history, and people on the far left who are really despairing that the ANC is not communist enough, kind of meeting on their opinion here that the last 28 years have been completely pointless, which is not true. Anyway, Marius, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. If you look from about 94 to 2008, on just about every metric, things were improving in South Africa. There was a combination of good internal policies. There was still some problems. We still had, the race-based policies were introduced in 2000 and whatever.
Right. And the
we had
AIDS denialism stuff.
Exactly. And bad foreign policy regards Zimbabwe and so on. And corruption was already an issue. It started under Nelson Mandela already. So it's not a new thing that suddenly happened under Jacob Zuma. And a lot of it was out of our hands, as you correctly point out. The commodities boom in the early 2000s was a big reason South Africa did well in that decade. But yeah, and also we were fiscally disciplined and so on. So I think that's all that kind of stuff. And it just shows you what good policies and not spending money profligately. Well, if I said it correctly, but spending money, that you don't have really. And it's, and shows you we can get back to that kind of thing. We just need the correct policies. South Africa's not beyond saving, that's for sure. But just one thing on the issue of service delivery, there was an election ad last year in the election where there's a road that's goes from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape, and you can see on the provincial border the difference between the Eastern Cape on the Eastern Cape side and the Western Cape side, where the Western Cape side's obviously been retarred and looks much better. But although I did see some people, the tweeters who I know aren't fans of the DA, said that it had been relayed very recently and only about a kilometer of it. So you could just take that photo. So, and it wasn't actually, but who knows what the truth was. But it also wouldn't surprise me if a DA road is much better than the Eastern Cape, or not DA road. Western Cape road is much better than Eastern Cape road.
All right. But let's close it now on this one and move on to our second topic, which is actually related to our first, in that a senior executive, or I don't know what to call him, a senior business person in South Africa has in fact called for reforms in quite a sort of strident way. This, of course, is MassMart Group Chairman Kusini Dlamini, who was writing in the group's latest annual report, and he said that he issued a warning to government, basically saying that if proper reform didn't come soon, South Africa was going to miss out on valuable skills and competition and economic development. So he first started off, as most South African business does, by kind of saying that, actually there've been some positive signs. He mentioned, I think, basically the only one, which is the lifting of the generation cap for businesses from, 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts of power, or from 1 megawatt. I can't remember what it was originally, but it's now up to 100 megawatts of power. Which is, of course, something that we are very happy with, and I think is definitely one of the best signs of the best reforms that has been put in by the Ramaphosa government. Unfortunately, it seems to be the only one, and Mr. Dlamini kind of points that out here in his letter in his report to the company. Says, if South Africa is to grow and prosper and our companies are to be globally competitive, we need to access scarce talent. We therefore need to make the visa process for people wishing to work in South Africa easier and more user-friendly. And this is a thing that actually surprised me. So, of course, as you know, we have this huge immigration problem where there's lots of very poor people coming here, often illegally, to look for a better life. But if you're a skilled immigrant, getting into South Africa is a nightmare. You have to provide police reports from every place you've ever lived at, showing that you have no criminal record and things like that. And it's really annoying. I talked to one person a couple of years ago who had worked in multiple countries around the world, and she said that the most onerous visa process was the one she did for South Africa, which is quite crazy. Anyway, so he basically just goes on to talk about a whole bunch of reforms that need to be done, repairs to infrastructure, sorting out SOEs, as he said there, improving the visa process so that it's easier to get skilled workers from overseas. and just generally improving service delivery. And of course, this follows after the fact that MassMart, which owns Macro and Game, reported a 65% decline in headline earnings per share for the 52 weeks ending in December 2021. So they had a bad year, and I can see now that they are at least perhaps cautiously, perhaps mildly, but making their voices heard here in calling on government to reform. And this is exactly what we need to see more of from business. He didn't touch any of the hot button reform issues like labor market stuff. But I don't know. Chris, what do you make of this? Do you think the group chairman of MassMart went far enough here or not far enough?
I guess it depends where you set the bar. So for a high bar, not nearly far enough. But as you say, it's good to at least have some of these comments and pushes every now and then. But you wonder whether from a body such as DEDLAC or BLSA, whether there will be that necessary majority and group momentum to use their influence to push things in a positive direction. Because for a lot of bigger businesses and corporates, unfortunately, they can use more regulations, more red tape to their benefit to keep out competition. Their bottom lines are fine. If we have something like the NHI, for example, certain big medical aids will probably be fine. If we have high minimum wages, bigger corporates will be okay. If we have something like the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, a sort of BE 2.0, bigger corporates have the necessary resources and political pool to deal with all the red tape and all the compliance, but small and medium businesses which don't comply or simply can't comply will be fined into oblivion. So it's I think it's the credit should be given when these comments are made, but it's all at the moment tinkering at the edges. Unfortunately, the reforms, such as one can call them, again, spectrum, visas, the self-generation point, even there you still need a permit from NERSA, so you could still be stuck in bureaucracy for months or not even years before you can self-generate. So all that stuff, you can say, okay, reform is happening, but it's not the kind of reforms that's going to get you 5 to 7% growth and really affect the 35% unemployment rate, unfortunately. So it's nice to talk about them now, but not the kind of momentum that is needed, and also not the comments which you need against contemplated policies. So, for example, expropriation without compensation, which would dilute all South Africans' property rights. And that's not going to encourage any skilled or unskilled people really to come here or to remain here in the first place. So also a bit more courage needed to speak out against the potentially negative benefits of policies, which I think the government remains strongly committed to.
Also on that point, it's going to be difficult to get human capital to come back to SA until the crime problem is sorted out, because that's really one of the things that drives people who can afford it away. I mean, there's nothing quite as traumatizing as being the victim of some kind of violent crime. And, even just hearing stories about it, even if it hasn't happened to you, can be enough to send people packing for overseas the moment they get the opportunity. Marius, what do you make of the comments here?
Yeah, I think it's they are quite positive. As I've said before, I think it's easy for us to sit here and say, big business must talk more, and we're not sure what's going on behind closed doors. And I think the businesses do have to temper their comments a bit more than people like us, But I think one thing where the big business has maybe lost something is, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, big business actually played a big role in pressuring the government to go a certain way. Not we also behind closed doors and so on, but they also worked a lot to fund guys to think about different options for South Africa, to host workshops and all that kind of thing. Business played a very important role in the public square, so to speak. But since since the transition from the mid-90s, business has often taken a backseat. Often when business has come out and been quite harsh on the government, they've been criticized, they've been called a racist or whatever. I think it was Tony Trahar. He was head of, I think it was Anglo American or Anglo Gold in the early 2000s. And he said South Africa's political risk was increasing. This is when South Africa was doing pretty well, as we said earlier. The ANC was at 70%, economy was growing at 5% a year and so on. And he came out and said South African political risk is on the increase. And Thabo Mbeki really tore into him. And I think that made a lot of people, but scared about standing up. FNB did the same thing a couple of years ago with the advertising campaign. I can't remember the exact details, but it was saying about, I think they would look at interviewing young kids and ask them what kind of South Africa they wanted. Obviously, some of the the answers were a bit embarrassing for the government, and there was also some criticism of that. So I think, as I say, I think it is quite hard for businesses often to say what they think, but I do think there is a place for them to be a bit more forthright in their opinions and not just hide behind BLSA or whatever the case is, and I think this is a good move. It might be the thin end of the wedge, and we don't know, maybe what was being said behind closed doors was much more forthright, and and I believe it would be. I mean, businesses have to be doing have to do what's good for their shareholders, and often I think they will be telling the government, look, we're losing money. This is not good for our shareholders. It's not good for our employees. If we lose money, we're going to have to fire people. That's not going to be good for South Africa's unemployment rate, which is already horrendous. But yeah, I think overall it's a pretty positive move, I think. But it's something to keep an eye on. But I think overall, I do get the feeling that business is being a bit more outspoken. And I think a lot of people thought Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be the kind of savior of South Africa, especially amongst the business leaders. But I think a lot of people have been disillusioned by that. I mean, this is something we said from before President Ramaphosa got into power. But yeah, I think a lot of people have seen through him. I mean, he's part of the, I've said this also about, I think we can look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe never had a Mugabe problem. It had a ZANU-PF problem. And South Africa also never had a Zuma problem. It's had an ANC problem. And I think that's obviously still the case. They're still the governing party in this country.
I must make a brief aside to apologize that all of our audio-only listeners are not able to see David's comment in the live chat there, which almost made me fall over laughing. But I managed to control myself. All right. So our last topic is one that's pretty spicy. So we don't have a lot of time to discuss it, but let's try it anyway. It's causing a lot of waves overseas, and this is a plan, a policy that has been agreed between Rwanda and the United Kingdom, where basically these asylum seekers or sort of economic refugees who come over often, like boats across the English Channel, or sometimes they hide in trucks through the Channel Tunnel. They arrive in the UK looking for a better life or safety from whatever country they originally came from. And this has become a very big problem in the UK over the last couple of years, with a lot of illegal crossings of the Channel to get into the UK. The UK, seeking to discourage this, has signed an asylum agreement with Rwanda, where if you are sort of caught after crossing into the country illegally, they will process your asylum application. They will send you then to Rwanda, where you will be settled permanently if you're found to be a refugee. Or if you are not a refugee and actually you can go back to the country you originally came from without risk of being sort of, I see we've lost Chris due to load shedding, without being, killed or, persecuted or whatever, then you can also stay there as well, or they'll deport you back to the country. So this has been a pretty contentious issue. A lot of people have said that this is illegal, that it's cruel. But the idea, I guess, is to discourage people from making this crossing, because the argument that the British government would make is you'll be safe in Rwanda, you'll be looked after as a refugee there, but you won't be able to. So you won't be in danger of being killed, but you won't be able to enjoy the economic benefits of moving to the UK, and hopefully that this will cut down on things like people smuggling, which is obviously quite a big problem because it often results in human trafficking and modern slavery. Marius, what do you make of this? There's a lot of things to tackle here, but what do you think? You're muted, sir.
It's actually a masterstroke by Rwanda. Rwanda, a lot of people seem to think it's, kind of the Singapore of East Africa, but it's basically a Potemkin country. It cooks the books of its economy. The president, Paul Kagame, is basically a dictator. Rwandan agents go around the world killing dissidents. We had people killed in Gauteng, in Joburg. I would recommend to anybody who's interested in Rwanda to read Mikela Rong's book called Do Not Disturb. It's about the murder of the guy, I can't remember his name now, but he was a general in the Rwandan army. He was a big ally of Paul Kagame, and they fell out, and he was eventually killed here. And how the Rwandan government, really, as I said, cooks the books around its economy. Economy is not nearly as strong as it is. I see people here saying that Rwanda it's really not. It's as I say, it tells lies about how big its economy is. It's not a democracy at all. There's no such thing as free speech. But it's a masterstroke by Rwanda because the British government is now going to back it. They're going to be talking about how amazing Rwanda is. Tory MPs are going to be talking about how amazing Rwanda is. Rwanda is also getting paid to take in these refugees. So it's been a very good move by Rwanda. And Rwanda's been very good at this. It's got big PR companies in the West who come out and support to talk about how great Rwanda is and how great Paul Kagame is and so on. And I think this is just part of it. And it's really a Machiavellian move by Paul Kagame, and it's very clever. But I just think people must not be confused by how amazing Rwanda is. If you go out of Kigali, it basically looks like any part in in Africa where it's undeveloped and whatever it's really not this place where people are flocking to. And it's we shouldn't be looking at it as some kind of model. And I don't think those people who are trying to get into Britain are going to be much better off by being sent to Rwanda.
So I'd love to discuss this more, but we are unfortunately out of time. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found the show at least interesting. And we will, of course, be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. But I hope you all have a wonderful and excellent day. Cheers, everyone.